Hello, welcome back. We will be reading further now in the story. If you like everything so far, please like and subscribe. It really means a lot to me, okay? Arc 1, Chapter 4, Compensation for a Lap Pillow. To Subaru, the feeling of waking up was rather similar to the sensation of raising his head out of water. Rays of sunshine assailed his pupils the moment his eyelids parted, causing him to grimace as he rubbed his eyes. He was rather good at waking up. Once his eyes opened, his consciousness would soon follow. "Ah, you're awake?" A voice directly overhead. As Subaru turned to face it, his body still on the ground, he realized that his head was resting on something rather soft. "Don't try to move just yet. Your head was hurt, so it's not safe." The voice worrying about him was gentle, and the sensation under his head was one of supreme bliss. Subaru thought back to what had happened before he lost consciousness and concluded that he was currently experiencing one of the greatest boons a man could receive. Holy crap, that beauty's giving me a lap pillow? Taking advantage of this divine blessing, Subaru started to toss and turn, enjoying the feel of her thighs to his heart's content. His circular motions brought delightful sensations to his cheeks, his face wrapped in a fluffy, "Man, pretty girls are a lot hairier than I thought." "Like hell. Glad to see you're up." Subaru played the straight man as he looked up. Now fully lucid, he could properly see what was before him. In his inverted line of sight was the face of an absurdly huge cat. Its expression was excessively ingratiating as it formed what seemed to be a smile. "I decided to be considerate and offer you some comfort until you woke up. First of all, quit doing that terrible falsetto." Having ended up in the absurd situation of receiving a lap pillow from a human-sized cat, that was Subaru's only request. He then went back to enjoying the furry sensation since it was so generously provided. "Fluffy, so fluffy. Just what in the world have you gone and created, God?" "Oh dear, it seems it was well worth it for me to change size if it brings you that much joy, right?" The giant cat shyly scratched its head and winked as if seeking agreement. In the direction of its gaze, at the entrance to the alley, a girl stood with her arms crossed in displeasure. She was the girl who had been burned into his eyes and memory before he lost consciousness. "So basically, you're that tiny kitty from before?" Foo. Its freely changing size makes it great for transport. It also brightens your day with humorous chit-chat. A cat for everyone. Goes great with your lifestyle. For more details, please contact the Spirit Association. It nimbly snapped its fingers and started a sales pitch. The contents weren't really relevant, but Subaru understood that was probably how it acted. "So you ended up staying here until I woke up?" "Don't get it twisted. I had some questions for you, so I had no choice but to stay. If that weren't the case, I would have just left you here. Definitely. Just so we're clear on that." When it was emphasized that much, even Subaru couldn't really say much in response. She spoke in a fierce tone as if pressing him. Considering his level 1 communication ability that was even worse when it came to the opposite sex, all Subaru could do was nod. "And that goes for me healing you and letting you enjoy Puck's lap too. All of it was for my own benefit, so I'll have you repay me now. You're putting on quite the act, but it ultimately wraps around to being a regular request, doesn't it? What goes around comes around, taken to the extreme." But in response to his answer, the girl shook her head with a stern expression. "That's not it. I'm making a demand here. Now you probably know who stole my insignia, right?" Subaru nervously accepted her condition, and she for some reason lowered her voice and asked him this. Subaru couldn't help but tilt his head at this. He had a really strong feeling that he'd heard this exact question before he lost consciousness. "Did I hit my head really hard while I was very briefly unconscious?" "You were out for at least 5 minutes, but as far as I know, nothing of the sort happened." "Then could it be déjà vu? Maybe I've awakened some hidden power that lets me experience the immediate future?" Perhaps he should call his ability "Come Back Yesterday." It could be rather useful to come up with the right answer to a question. Perhaps it'd even be possible to prepare for tough questions on tests. His dream started spiraling out of control. I was a shut-in. Quit ignoring me and calm down already, would you? Now answer me. I have to say, I don't really know. The so-called insignia was probably something like those badges people like lawyers, prosecutors, members of the defense force, etc., had to prove their identity. Unfortunately, Subaru had no memory whatsoever of seeing such a thing in the hour or so he was here. Back home, he had a veritable mountain of toy badges he'd collected as a child, but he didn't know how to return there, and he'd probably get smashed by her ice if he tried offering her one. Consequently, his answer couldn't possibly meet her expectations, but the girl simply nodded, not disappointed in the slightest. I see. That's that then. But I did learn that you don't know anything, so that shall suffice as compensation for healing you. Her logic regarding her total loss would have shocked the sleaziest swindler. Leaving a dumbfounded Subaru behind, she loudly clapped her hands together as if she'd completely gotten over it. I'll be going then. Sorry, but I'm in a hurry. Your injuries are almost gone, and those guys probably won't come after you again considering how scared they were. But wandering into deserted alleys alone at a time like this is basically suicide. I'm not worried or anything, I'm just warning you. I won't have a reason to save you if this happens again, so you'd better not expect anything. Her mouth moved rapidly as she spoke at length, and perhaps interpreting Subaru's silence as agreement, she seemed satisfied as she turned away. Her long silver hair swayed with her movements, and even in that gloomy alley, it had a fairy tale-like luster to it. Subaru's support suddenly disappeared, and he hastily stopped his fall. When he turned around, the cat's giant body was nowhere to be found, having returned to the palm-sized form he'd originally seen. Floating through the air like a balloon, it turned toward the girl. Sorry about that. She just can't be upfront about such things, this daughter of mine. Don't think her strange for it. Saying this in a jovial tone, the cat gently landed on her shoulder. She patted its back as if to confirm this, after which it disappeared into her hair. Subaru's eyes followed her dashing form as she walked away, and he thought intently about what the cat had said to him, the real motivation behind her words and actions. It seemed she had been robbed of something really important to her, and she was pursuing the culprit. She then saw a stranger being assaulted and stopped to help him despite this. On top of that, she even wasted her time healing him and watched over him until he woke up and then repeated her earlier question and deemed that sufficient compensation so he wouldn't feel indebted to her. It was far beyond the level where you could say she wasn't upfront about things. It was the first time in his life he'd seen someone so absurdly considerate. From her perspective, there was absolutely nothing to gain from interacting with him. On top of losing her target, she spent precious time healing him. Considering this, it could be said that she'd actually sustained a great loss here. She had every right to criticize him, and he would accept all of it. But in the end, she didn't do that, nor did she ask for an apology. Why? According to her, it was because saving him was all part of her self-serving plan. Living like that, you're going to lose everything. He stood up with those words and patted his dirt-covered jersey. The filth made his well-used jersey stand out, but it had sustained no real damage, and most importantly, all the pain from his beating was completely gone. He rotated his shoulders and stretched his legs as he confirmed his condition, once again realizing just how absurd magic was, and also how abnormal the girl was, having done this much for him and demanding next to nothing in return. Hey, wait up. As she looked around at the spot where the alley connected to the main street, a voice called out from behind her. Smoothing down her hair with her hand, she seemed annoyed as she turned around. What? We've already said everything we needed to say, so we no longer have anything to do with each other. We're merely strangers whose paths intersected for a moment. Don't say such heart-rending things. And even if you intended to end things, I think it's far from over." Her eyes were cold as he approached, as if clinging to her. Some part of him thought this scene was very much like a boy pursuing a girl who'd given him the cold shoulder, but he pressed on, spreading his arms to block her path. "That thing's important to you, right? Let me help you find it." "But you don't." "It's true that I haven't a clue as to the culprit's name, background, or fetishes, but I at least know what she looks like. A pretty girl with a snaggletooth and striking blonde hair. She was shorter than you, and flatter too, and maybe 2 or 3 years younger, but I was like, really?" It was a bad habit of his to become tense and speak at extreme speed when he was at his wit's end. A habit that was clearly on display at this very moment. Frankly, even he himself was repulsed by this. There was too much unnecessary crap like chests and fetishes, and using words like pretty girl and really. Just who am I supposed to be? I gave up on English in my first year of middle school. In his first year of middle school, he'd gotten rid of his English textbook in the middle of summer break, and he'd sworn off using loanwords ever since, enacting a personal policy of national isolation. So how on earth could he just litter his speech with English? It seemed as though Subaru was about to embark on a journey of self-reflection, full of strain and regret. His back was soaked with cold sweat. His arms were in a dreadful state due to the sweat from his palms and armpits. He was besieged by heart palpitations, breathlessness, dizziness, anemia, nasal congestion, and migraines as he stood there. He'd driven himself into a corner, and what saved him was, "You're a strange guy." The girl's voice, her finger on her lip as she slightly tilted her head, as though looking at some exotic animal. She stared at him as if appraising him, and then, "Let me just say this. I can't offer you anything in return. I'm completely broke." "It was all stolen, you see." "Relax, I'm basically broke as well." There's nothing reassuring about that, though. Consciously ignoring the intermittent interjections, Subaru vigorously struck his chest. "And I don't need a reward or anything. I just want to thank you." "I haven't done anything to deserve your thanks. You already repaid me for the healing." She remained stubborn to the very end. Her obstinate attitude made Subaru smile bitterly as he continued, "If so, I'm helping you for my own sake too. My objective is, that. I want to do some good deeds." "Good deeds?" "That's right. If you do a whole lot of them, you get to go to heaven when you die. It's basically my dream life, lazing about all you want, living as self-indulgently as you please, and it's like it's just waiting for me. That's why you have to let me help you." He didn't really understand what he was saying himself, but he said what he wanted to. He looked as though he'd just accomplished some great task, but the girl seemed rather pensive. However, the cat on her shoulder started poking her cheek with its paw. "I'm not sensing any malice. Wouldn't it be best to take him up on his offer? You don't have any leads, and you can hardly search the whole capital. But your stubbornness is definitely cute, but it'd be foolish to lose sight of your objective because of it. I don't want to think of my own daughter as a fool." The cat shrugged its shoulders as it provoked her, causing her to raise her eyebrow. The next several seconds were filled with strangely erotic ahs, uns, and buts, but in the end, "I really can't give you anything, you know." Saying this, she took his outstretched hand. Arc 1, Chapter 5, Your Name. His first friendly interaction in this world. About 30 minutes after he offered to help her in that heartwarming exchange. What exactly is this? Their investigation had led nowhere. The girl's eyes were cold as she asked this, her dissatisfied gaze directed at Subaru, who had just discovered something. Namely, that cold gaze is actually kind of exciting. Wait, no, it can't be. I was an M all along? "I don't know about this or whatever, but it's clear to me that you're talking complete nonsense." Making no effort to hide her exasperation, she crossed her arms and sighed. Her criticism was scathing, but it was probably appropriate considering what Subaru had managed to accomplish over these past 30 minutes. Subaru himself had offered to help her search for her missing item, but there were a number of problems that made their search extremely difficult. To begin with, he had no idea where he was. As far as that was concerned, it couldn't really be helped considering he was just summoned from another world, but it was a major hurdle considering the girl was also unfamiliar with the area. They had both assumed the other person knew the way, and ended up wasting almost 10 minutes wandering around the back alleys. A funny story to tell at this point, but they couldn't really laugh at it. Secondly, he couldn't read their language. He'd neglected this since conversation wasn't a problem, but upon examining his surroundings again, he noticed what seemed to be handwritten hieroglyphics all over the place. He didn't realize this at first, but considering they were even written on signs and the like, unless mystic runes had become all the rage around here, they were probably this world's alphabet. As a result, he couldn't differentiate shops by their signs, and he couldn't rely on signposts to navigate either. In summary, the typical cliché of "why do they speak and write the same language?" had only delivered on the former, it seemed. But if one considered that he'd probably be dead in some ditch if he didn't at least have that, it could be said that his situation wasn't that bad. Even if that were the case, this explosion in difficulty is absurd. Far from the kind of story where the hero comes in with unbeatable cheats, it was more like he didn't even have the minimum level of preparation. And most importantly, the crucial problem that had earned the girl's ire. "You've just been hiding behind me this entire time. You haven't been helpful in the slightest. I mean, it's kinda scary talking to people you've just met. You're not some kid." Her well-shaped eyebrows scowled as though she was having a headache, and she spoke in a rather pitying voice. Just as Subaru feared, the hurdle of obtaining information from strangers proved to be too much for him. His communication ability had dropped precipitously over the past year. He merely clung to her silently, like a shy boy following his mother. He certainly wanted to say something in response to her disappointment, but his cowardliness ran deep, and the words wouldn't come out. Thus, the cat on her shoulder, who had been silent thus far, started waving its tail and, "Relax, at least he has no ill intent." That's even worse. It'd be easier to believe he's sabotaging me, honestly. To be so utterly useless with good intentions, it's honestly harder to deal with than enmity. Sure is enlightening, huh? The cat's uncaring attitude made the girl sigh. She then looked at the street yet again and continued, "But even so, this really is tough." A small complaint left her mouth. Having moved from the alley they were in earlier, and even from the street connecting to it, they were now far from the hustle and bustle of civilization as they entered the slums. Though discouraged, they continued their investigation and ultimately ended up here. They said that stolen goods were usually handled in the slums. We know the location and the culprit's appearance, so why not leave the rest to the the guards? We'd find it right away if we had a lot of people working on it. A shopkeeper about 2 streets away had told them about a narrow alley connecting to the slums. It was true that the sun was going down, but despite being right next to the street, the place was gloomy for reasons other than the light source. The depressing atmosphere and foul smell caused Subaru's face to scrunch up reflexively. The atmosphere, mood, and probably even the inhabitants' personalities are all bad. It'd be best to call someone. No way. He wasn't merely nervous or afraid. He'd suggested this after carefully considering his ability and the girl's safety, but he was turned down on the spot. Subaru was bewildered by this declaration, and the girl seemed somewhat apologetic. "I'm sorry, but that's no good. I don't think the guards will come running over a little theft like this, and also, I can't rely on them due to personal circumstances." Sealing her lips, she looked at him as if to say, "I can't say why, though. Having understood she probably didn't want to be questioned, Subaru raised his hand in compliance. To begin with, he wasn't so boorish as to pry into others' affairs, and getting too involved with others was a pain anyway. If he were interested in interpersonal relationships, he wouldn't have become a shut-in. "All right, what do we do then?" Even having heard nothing of her circumstances, Subaru asked about her next course of action. Not seeking the reason and deciding whether or not to stop helping her were entirely different matters. He may not have known her circumstances, but he didn't want to be an ingrate. Perhaps sure that Subaru would leave her, the girl's eyebrows rose in surprise at this. The cat started doing a little dance on her shoulder. "I told you, didn't I? Not a hint of ill will." Fooling around as usual, it seemed terribly cheerful as it pointed at Subaru. However, its expression suddenly became serious. "But you'd better decide carefully. It's almost nightfall, so I won't be able to help you. A few hoodlums wouldn't be a problem, but be careful." "Yeah, you're right. Okay, I'll think about it, but—" Her answer was indecisive. As she seemed to struggle with her response, Subaru suddenly became curious and asked the cat, "What were you just talking about? You can't be around at night?" To put it more precisely, despite my cute looks, I'm actually a spirit, you see. Manifestation alone consumes a great deal of mana, so at night I fully return to my Yorishiro and focus on building up mana. I'd say on average a 9-to-5 schedule would be ideal. 9 to 5, you sound like a civil servant. Spirit's terms of employment are unexpectedly severe. Unusual terms like spirit or Yorishiro were flying around as though it were natural, but a modern otaku corrupted by games and anime wouldn't have a hard time understanding them. Anyhow, the cat before him, or rather Puck's contract did not include a night shift. He didn't look reliable at all, but considering how terrified those thugs from the alley were, setting aside Puck himself, the beings known as spirits did seem to possess power befitting them. A being who inspired far more fear than the girl who could magically create ice. Contrary to his unusually idyllic atmosphere, his true nature might have been that of a man-eater that craved blood. Thinking of it that way, you're unexpectedly terrifying. Let me just say this, I'm really sinewy, so I probably taste really bad. I can kind of read your mind to some extent, so you really are a nut, huh? It felt like he intended to say that in a roundabout fashion, but completely failed to do so. Puck's fluffy forehead then moved in a gesture similar to a frown. "Come to think of it, I don't even know your name. I don't believe we ever introduced ourselves." "Ah, I guess so. Then let's start with me." Subaru cleared his throat and then spun on the spot, striking a pose as he thrust his finger into the sky. "My name is Natsuki Subaru. I'm utterly lost and completely broke. Nice to meet you." "Sounds like you're in a real tough spot, huh? All right then, I'm Puck. Nice to meet you." Subaru had extended his hand in a gesture of goodwill, and Puck flew right into it, a dynamic handshake with his whole body. From an outsider's perspective, it looked like Subaru was crushing him. Puck was just as fluffy as he was in his giant form. Once he'd had his fill of the sensation, Subaru turned to the girl next to him. Her gaze was sour as she watched this exchange between man and animal. "Why can't you ever set that overly familiar attitude aside for a moment? It's unnecessary. I was at my wit's end and found a thread I could cling to. Damn it, I'm never letting this go, this encounter. My life itself depends on it. Your determination is completely pointless. Say, do you even remember under what pretense you joined us? Of course. You're now searching for a person rather than an object, and I'm the only one who knows what they look like. You think I'll let you get rid of me just like that? I'll never leak my secrets." Although I do recall you murmuring blonde hair, and her teeth, "Ah, never mind," and the like as you hid behind me while we questioned people, so you've leaked quite a bit. Curse my own foolishness. He grabbed his head and bent over on the spot. It was like he was playing poker while showing his opponent his hand. Attempting to negotiate like that was simply laughable. Even though she was his first friendly contact in this world, it seemed like she was about to slip away from him, and that made him terribly anxious. Puck smiled wryly as he watched Subaru struggle. Well, you've both got your own problems to deal with. Let's hear you out later and prioritize the issue at hand. Be that as it may, that's an unusual name. Has a nice ring to it. I guess so. It's not a name you hear around here. Speaking of which, your hair and eye color and even your clothes are all rather unique. Where are you from? According to the template, a small nation to the east, probably. A well-worn pattern when it came to parallel world stories. An isolated land in the Far East, akin to Zipangu. A magical cliché where you could just say you were from some other country, and most people would simply accept it, since in such worlds international relations were generally very lacking. However, Lugunica is the easternmost country on our continental map. There's nothing to the east of here. No way, seriously? This is as far east as it goes? Then what about the well-beloved Zipangu? You have no clue where you are. You're penniless, and you can't talk to others because you're scared. Your future doesn't look very promising, in a number of ways. The girl seemed restless, her eyes somewhat worried as she looked at Subaru's panicked state. Despite her attempts to hide it, her extremely helpful nature seemed to be overflowing. His completely helpless state was probably making her very uneasy. Puck watched over them with a smile as they agonized over this. He then started plucking at his whiskers. Well, just suck it up for now. Right now we should head. I have less than an hour left. Make a decision. I'll go. I don't intend to let her get away. It'll be too late if she manages to take it somewhere we can't reach. That was her reply to Puck. She then turned to Subaru. I'm going to head in now, but the path ahead will be a lot more dangerous. When night falls, there will probably be some hoodlums up to no good. And to begin with, this is a place where battle-hardened people live. If it's scary, you can wait here, or follow behind me like you were doing before. How much of a chicken would I have to be to decide to stay behind? I'm going. I'll stick right behind you the whole time. There isn't the option of heading out front, huh? Well, that works for me too, since I won't have to worry as much. She'd sighed so many times now, he'd lost count. Subaru reflected on how he only ever made her expression worsen. Thinking back, he hadn't seen her smile even once. She looked like that when angry, so her smile was probably the cutest thing in the world. Can a matchbox? No, but a tin can. What's this all of a sudden? Strange. No effect, but why? Ah, damn it. Does this world not have tin cans? Is your refrigerator running? No refrigerators either? This abnormality in his speech and mannerisms. It's not a curse or something of the sort, is it? No, that was completely voluntary. He put his heart and soul into it too, for an utterly meaningless pursuit. Perhaps having guessed the reason for Subaru's incredible struggle, Puck explained things relatively favorably. On the other hand, it only resulted in the seed of doubt being planted in the girl to whom it looked like Subaru had suddenly started malfunctioning. Regretting that his terrible puns only worked in his original world, Subaru desperately shook his head. Focusing too hard on what was in front of him and losing sight of the bigger picture, this too was one of his flaws. What's the difference between snowmen and snowwomen? Snowballs. He'd finally found one that didn't rely on modern knowledge, but the girl's reaction wasn't favorable in the slightest. She coldly turned away. Her eyes were on the alley, probably indicating that she wouldn't play along any further. His momentary desire to see her smile had completely backfired. Are you satisfied, Subaru? The girl called to Subaru, whose self-hatred was currently maxed out due to his terrible attempt and the equally terrible outcome. The fact that she'd said his name for the first time, and also the idea of a member of the opposite sex using his name so casually, made him just a little nervous. Yeah, totally chill, completely cool, I feel great, I can win. Why are you trembling like that? I get that you're scared, but we haven't even entered yet. You really would be better off waiting out here if you're that terrified." With this misdirected worry, she let out a small sigh and turned her attention away for real. As he watched her walk into the alley, Subaru suddenly realized she did not intend to leave him even if she was successful. By telling him to wait here, she was signaling that she would come back for him upon finding it. In the less than the hour they'd known each other, her strange inability to deceive for personal gain had become apparent. "This sucks. I'm so uncool." Despite having offered to help, he was absolutely useless to her, and on top of that, he was even making her worry about him. He was far beyond the point of being a deadbeat. Striking his cheeks, he used the pain to force himself to focus and advanced forward. He still had a mountain of complaints. Anyone would be helpless if they were suddenly forced into such a harsh world. He didn't think badly of himself for this. However, relying on her for absolutely everything would be pathetic. I should at least have her back. Though dependent, he'd have to stand on his own two legs. But despite having focused, he ended up zeroing in on the small stuff. Come to think of it, there's one more thing. When he called out from behind her, he saw her glance at him through a gap in her silver hair. Even this sidelong glance was dauntingly attractive, but Subaru managed to get his question out. "So I've heard your cat's name, but I never caught yours." This somewhat playful question caused her to look ahead and fall silent for a bit. This caused Subaru to panic, wondering if he screwed up. Perhaps her earlier silence was to indicate that she didn't want to tell him her name. His communication disorder that rendered him unable to read others' hearts, much less a woman's, could it still... Satella. Oh? As he agonized over this, her sudden whisper surprised him. She didn't even turn to look at him, and she repeated without any emotion, "You can call me Satella." As she gave her name, her attitude suggested that he definitely shouldn't call her that. Subaru had wanted to learn her surname if possible. He couldn't call her name just like that, so he ended up falling silent. For now, he would just refer to her in the second person, a rather pathetic compromise. Behind the scenes of this exchange, Puck muttered from within her hair, "That's in terrible taste." These words did not reach either of them. Arc 1, Chapter 6, The End of the Beginning. Their investigation had them entering the slums, and as usual they were faced with signs of terrible, or rather, contrary to expectations, an unexpected development resulted in Subaru proving useful. "This place is super gentle for some reason. What is this? Could it be that my popular period has suddenly arrived? For the first time since kindergarten." Subaru had very lovely features as a child, and his hair was long as well, which caused him to be mistaken for a girl rather frequently. On the other hand, he'd ended up like this over 10 years later, so it wasn't really a laughing matter. "Well, this is just a guess, but let's hear it. If there's a scientific... Wait, since this is fantasy, wouldn't it be magical? If there's a magical basis for this, I want to hear it." This probably isn't the answer you're hoping for, but it's probably because of your appearance. You're kind of filthy, and you've got traces of blood on you. The people here seem to be struggling too, so they probably find you relatable. I understand completely, damn it all. It now seemed obvious why they were all so friendly. Among them was an old lady who offered him a small dry fruit, saying, "Eat this and live strong." When he nervously tried putting it in his mouth, he felt a slight sweetness under its hard surface, and then a terrible odor violently flowed out. The feeling of his nose being destroyed from the inside caused him to pass out. Damn it all, I thought she was being considerate, but she poisoned me. That was poison. It's like my whole body is burning. I might seriously end up dying here, or I might strip and end up dead from a social perspective. Looks like you received a bako fruit. It stimulates the mana within you when you eat it, and accelerates healing and stuff. The effect varies by person. For most, it's rather soothing. Satella put a finger to her lip and went, as she watched Subaru heat up and sweat as he breathed ragged breaths. "It seems to me that your body circulates mana very well. If you overdosed, you might die." "Tell me that before I eat it. What do I do?" "Yeah, Puck." Responding to her call, Puck emerged from within her hair. His movements were dull, and his earlier liveliness had vanished. To put it simply, he was extremely sleepy. It seemed like he wasn't even listening to most of their conversation. He rubbed his large eyes as he said, "What? I'm at my limit, you know." "You'd better fill up before going to bed then. There's a feast for you right here." As he felt a bit of bite to her words, Subaru realized Puck was now looking at him, his sleepy eyes sparkling like he was looking at a delicacy. "Can I really? Be gentle." Despite being a little worried that he was going to be chomped up, Subaru replied playfully. Puck gave a vague response and then stretched his tiny body on Satella's shoulder. "All right, let's eat." Immediately after, Subaru felt whatever had been rampaging around inside him start to drain out in large quantities. It was hard to say from where exactly. If he had to say, it was like it was being drained out of every pore on his body, rather uncomfortable. That was quite the treat. Puck joined his hands in thanks. Subaru wanted to reply with something along the lines of, "You're more than welcome," but he suddenly felt a terrible chill throughout his body. The heat had directly transitioned into cold, and no ordinary cold either. He could feel it from his very core. He instinctively grabbed his shoulders, the sight of this causing Satella to glare at Puck in reproach. "Puck." Sorry, it's been a while so I couldn't quite control it. But his gait does feel strange. It doesn't seem like it's seen much use, but it pours mana right out. That's why I ended up going a bit too far." "Tee-hee," he laughed bashfully as he tapped his head. But to Subaru this was no laughing matter. Yet again there were unfamiliar words being used, like gate or mana. "Probably something like MP, huh? And I'm in this state because it's been drained." His gamer brain once again displayed its ability to immediately grasp such concepts. The problem then was just how important MP was in this world. If MP restores were extremely expensive, it could be said that this was a very troublesome act. "I apologize. We'll talk about this later. I'm reflecting on my actions. I don't regret it, though. That was delicious." Puck's attitude resembled that of the protagonist of a certain manga, and Satella hadn't scolded him very severely. Judging by this, it probably wasn't a huge issue. If that were the case, it'd be uncool for him to get hung up on this. "Relax. At least I don't feel like I'm going to burn to death now. More importantly, let's keep pursuing the culprit, whose location was determined thanks to my efforts. Thanks to my hard work, we were able to... I understand that you're happy to have been useful, but saying it twice really isn't cool." He'd wanted to change the topic, but ended up sounding like a bragging kid. Satella looked like she regretted raising her opinion of him, and Subaru simply forced a smile. It was about time they decided to go further into the slums. "Sorry, I'm out of time." Saying this, Puck, who was still on Satella's shoulder, feebly leaned against her neck. His gray coat was tinged with bits of light, lightly wavering as though he could disappear at any moment. "It kinda looks like he's about to die, huh?" "It's because I really pushed myself. I use mana to manifest, so it disperses when I disappear. My crystal, please." "Got it. Sorry to push you so hard, Puck. Take it easy." Satella retrieved a green palm-sized crystal from her bosom. It felt somewhat different from what one would call a gem. As far as Subaru knew, he could only say it seemed crystalline. Puck walked down Satella's arm to reach the crystal, and then he turned to her as his small body embraced it. "I'm sure you know this, but you mustn't go too far. If the situation looks desperate, use your odd to force me out." "I understand. I'm not a kid. I can handle myself." "I wonder. I can't say I trust my daughter very much in that regard. I'm counting on you, Subaru." Puck's smile was full of compassion as he looked away from a displeased Satella and toward Subaru. Subaru thought their interactions were very much like that of a parent and child, As he watched them, he then struck his chest when he was called to. "All right, leave her to me. You can expect great things from my jitter sensor. If my danger alert goes off, we'll retreat immediately." "I don't understand half of what you said, but I'm trusting you." "All right then. Good night, Puck. Take care." Puck looked at her one last time before he vanished from the world. Just as he said, his form started scattering into particles of light. This sight wouldn't have been possible in Subaru's old world, and it sent shivers through his whole body. Once Puck was gone, Satella started stroking the crystal as if it were terribly precious to her, and then put it back in her chest. Following the typical flow of things, Puck's essence was probably stored in there in an ethereal form. "We're alone now, but you'd better not try anything strange. I can use magic." Not knowing what he was thinking, perhaps she thought he was just staring at her breasts. In response to her words of caution, Subaru instinctively put his hands up and started shaking his head. "No way. I haven't been alone with a girl since elementary. I couldn't possibly try anything. You've seen my people skills, haven't you?" "That's so nonsensical, and yet also really convincing. All right, let's go. But we don't have Puck looking out for us, so we'll have to be more careful." Perhaps dumbfounded by Subaru puffing his chest out with pride, Satella tightened her robe and moved ahead of him. She then turned her head toward him without moving from her spot. "I'll be the vanguard and you'll look out from behind. If something happens, call to me immediately. Don't try to do anything on your own. I don't want to hurt your feelings, but you're weak." Prefacing it like that, I really can't dislike you. If she wanted to preserve her cold image, she should have omitted the part before "you're weak" and said it more harshly. It showed her kindness that she just couldn't hide. She really was sweet to the core, enchantingly so. Satella looked like she wanted to complain as he urged her onward. Their 2-member search had begun. Having said that, their task hadn't really changed. Find some inhabitants, describe the culprit's features, and ask if they know anyone like that. Rinse and repeat. Subaru was in charge of this, and he became more and more used to it the more he did it. Maybe it could be felt. A tricky little blonde, right? This useful piece of information came from the 14th man they'd asked. He was another person Subaru had called to in an overfamiliar fashion, such as, "Yo, brother, how goes it?" He looked at Subaru's dirtied appearance with sympathy and, "If it's felt, your lost item's probably in the loot house right now. Stolen goods are tagged and stored there, and the owner gathers them up to sell elsewhere." What a strange system. What if this owner just ran off with the goods? He's the owner because they trust that he won't do that. But well, even if you tell him you had something stolen from you, it's not like he'll return it just like that. You'll have to negotiate for it. Because the theft was on the victim for being careless, such was the logic of the slums, and he forced it on them with a laugh despite his favorable attitude. They'd managed to obtain the loot house's location from him, and it seemed like she would very soon be reunited with her stolen item. However, a different problem had manifested, the problem being that they were both totally broke. He told us to buy it back, but what now? On top of our shortcomings in this regard, this seems like the kind of event where we get overcharged or something. I'm just retrieving what was stolen from me. Why must I pay to do so, I wonder? Once the problem had become one of funds, Satella's expression suddenly clouded over. Her spontaneous mutter was certainly correct, but it was also true that their opponent wasn't the sort to be swayed by that. To settle things peacefully, and moreover reliably, it would be best to take the man's advice. Nonetheless, does this stolen insignia look expensive? Even if they overcharge us, without knowing the market value, it would be. It has a small jewel in the middle. I don't know its monetary value either, but it definitely isn't cheap. A jewel, huh? That's troublesome. Any buffoon could immediately recognize it was valuable at a glance. That was the sort of convenient effect jewels had. It didn't look like this world had the technology to create imitations. so it seemed certain that almost everything that appeared to be a jewel would be the real thing. If that were the case, their inherent value would be obvious. He understood that they had nothing to be relieved about, but there was also something else about her statement that bothered him. She said she didn't know how much her insignia was worth. It was certainly possible that it was given to her, but he still felt somewhat uneasy. Anyway, let's try going there first and then think about it. I might be able to negotiate a decent price depending on how I go about it. Worst case scenario, Subaru had a method that could prove disastrous for him. His vague wording made Satella frown, but Subaru waved his hand in response to her doubt. They had walked for about 10 minutes, agonizing over their financial situation and coming up with no solutions. Having arrived at the so-called loot house, the two looked at each other. It's bigger than we thought, huh? Shows why they call it that. If everything in there is stolen as the name implies, there's really no helping it. Of course, since they were periodically selling things off, it probably wasn't filled to the brim with loot. Subaru thought this as he looked at the loot house, its appearance not quite fitting its coarse name as it beckoned to them. By Subaru's estimate, it was probably around the size of a convenience store, parking lot included. It only had 1 floor, but it was large enough to fit 20 cars with ease. Their surroundings had changed too. The various ruins and hovels were nowhere to be seen, and behind the loot house was a giant wall. It was quite literally in the deepest part of the slums. That tall wall thing, probably the capital's border wall, looks like we came to the very edge without realizing it. Her statement caused Subaru to idly imagine what a map of the capital might look like. It was probably square-shaped, guarded by these walls on all sides. Within those walls, perhaps in the center or the northernmost area, there would be a castle, and far away from there, one could find these slums. He felt like it had been 2 or 3 hours since they started their search, so he had an idea as to the capital's size. But then, if he compared it to Japan, which didn't have such clear divisions, its size wasn't really comparable. Well then, if the rumors are true, the owner of the place should be in there. But, considering our position, how do we approach this? I'll be upfront about it. I had something stolen, so return it if it's in here. That sort of thing. Subaru insisted that this wouldn't work any number of times, but she refused to listen. She was virtuous to her core. She couldn't bring herself to consider using twisted means so easily. But it was precisely because she was that kind of girl that she stopped to help Subaru even though it brought her no benefit. Ah, got it. Then leave this to me. There was a high possibility that things would go south, so Subaru reluctantly offered to go himself. His last resort. This was too hasty, so it didn't really feel like a trump card, but it would also be a problem to lose the timing entirely. Subaru wouldn't hesitate when it came to such matters. Meanwhile, Satella seemed puzzled by this suggestion. His newfound confidence made her look at him with suspicion. All right, I'm counting on you. I get that you can't agree just like that. After all, I myself understand that I haven't done anything to win your trust. But I do have an idea, so try to believe it. Why are you so surprised? I mean, this is completely different from the typical pattern, isn't it? Leave it to a good-for-nothing like you, who can barely even talk to others. Don't make me laugh. Even a dog would be better. I was prepared to hear something like that. As if I'd say something so terrible. His paranoia had offended her. However, she cleared her throat and fixed her amethyst eyes on him. It's true that you haven't been particularly useful thus far, and you haven't done or said anything to inspire any sort of confidence, but what kind of appraisal is that? I can't refute it, though. But I believe you think things through, and I don't think you're a liar. She stopped his self-deprecation in its tracks, and then took a breath and continued. I'll try believing in you. It'd be a great stroke of luck if you actually succeeded. Instead of that last part, something like, do your best for my sake, would really get me motivated, you know? I can't be that demanding, but do your best. A girl who could not lie in every sense of the phrase. Subaru responded with a broad smile and turned toward the entrance. This definitely wasn't easy on him, but he felt like her expectations and that little bit of trust were giving him the push he needed. If he came back without accomplishing anything, he really would be completely useless. As he walked, Subaru looked at the plastic bag in his hand, which had never once become the topic of conversation thus far. Within it were the items he'd brought with him from the other world. As far as Subaru was concerned, they were all that he had in this world. He might be able to barter with them. He didn't know how much this insignia was worth, but surely it couldn't be more than his cell phone, which would be the only one of its kind in this world. This would be a great loss for him, but negotiation should be possible if he used them to trade. That was the last resort he'd kept secret from her. Of course, he also had a bunch of cards that would be useless in this world. If he had the chance to use them, he should do so. Is anyone home? Standing before the wooden door, he tried knocking on it. The sound was deeper than he expected, but there was no response from within. He hesitantly reached for the handle, and the door readily opened as if there were no lock on it. The interior had no lighting. It was so dark that one could only fumble around. It was supposed to be a place where stolen goods were stored, and yet for some reason there was no one standing guard. Maybe they're in the toilet or something. Anybody there? Subaru poked his head in to look around, but not even the moonlight reached the room, leaving it pitch black. As he was welcomed by stale air and an unpleasant odor, Subaru built up his resolve and took a step forward. But first, he turned to Satella. If the two of us walk in just like that, we might look like burglars. How about you stay out here? Are you sure? Perhaps I ought to be the one. I've already called out a bunch, so I probably won't be cut down just like that. It'd be dangerous if the owner were to misunderstand, so please leave it to me. Subaru bowed his head to her as she contemplated this. She then reached into her robe and pulled out a white crystal which she held out toward him. You should at least have some light. Whether or not someone's there, call out to me. I understand. Carefully, huh? How do I turn this thing on? You don't even know how to use lagmite? You really are ignorant, huh? She said in a tone that was both amused and surprised as she lightly struck the lagmite against the wall, causing it to produce a pale white glow. It was very dim, barely illuminating a few meters at most, but it would be enough to discern imminent danger. These days most people use mana-based lights instead, but this is a lot simpler and I quite like it. If it goes out, just do that again and it'll light up. I see. Seems pretty convenient. All right, I'll head in for a bit. Lagmite in hand, Subaru timidly walked in. Don't force yourself, Satella said from behind him, and he responded by raising his hand. When Subaru passed the entrance, a small counter entered his dim field of view. Perhaps this place was originally a tavern or something. On the other side were some broken boxes. One might guess that the owner or someone else had been sitting there. The counter also seemed to play the role of a reception desk and had various items on it. Small boxes, jars, and all sorts of blades were carelessly strewn about. He was in the dark in both the physical sense and the intellectual sense, so he couldn't hazard a guess as to their worth. But to the untrained eye, they definitely didn't look very valuable. I suppose it's obvious. The valuables must be further inward. The stolen items also had wooden tags attached. It seemed like characters had been carved into these with something sharp. According to what the man from before had said, these were probably the names of the thieves who had stolen them. It seemed like they could catch all of these guys in one shot if they just gathered these up and handed them over to the guards. Well, there's also the possibility that they're using fake names. And in a situation like this, there's plot lines where the country has a dark side that's in cahoots with the criminals. There was also the question of just where these stolen goods were going. He could just skim ahead if this were a novel or manga. Such were his detestable thoughts as he walked further inward. There were still no signs of life, but even with his dim light, he could make out that the goods were increasing in size and value as he went deeper. An insignia with a jewel embedded in it would surely be all the way in the back then. As he thought this, his footsteps unintentionally quickened, and then, Subaru stopped when he suddenly felt something strange under his shoes. It wasn't the discomfort of stepping on something hard. On the contrary, whatever he had stepped on had some give. It felt like he'd stepped on something sticky. When he raised his leg and felt the sole of his sneaker, he noticed a thick liquid sticking to it. When his finger felt its strange stiffness, he felt a primal fear surge from within. "What is this?" He brought his finger to his nose to smell it, but the stale air prevented him from realizing exactly what it was. Even so, he simply didn't have the courage to bring it to his mouth for a taste. He rubbed it off on the wall and pointed his light forward as if prompted by his unease. At his destination was the source. "Ah," his voice leaked out when he finally saw it. Under the dim light, what he first saw was an arm sloppily lying on the ground. Its fingers were open, as if reaching for something, and strangely, there was nothing above the elbow. He raised his light, as if to look for the rest of it, and there he found a leg. Perhaps it was fortunate that the leg was still attached to the torso, and the body had most of the parts it was supposed to have. With a torn-up neck and a missing arm, what lay before him was the corpse of a large old man. "Hi." Once he realized this, his mouth produced a meaningless noise. What filled his mind right now was not fear, despair, or shock. His mind was overwhelmingly blank. All thought had completely ceased. Even the options to run or stay did not exist in his brain. The blankness simply had him stand stock still until his brain fully absorbed the sight before him. This would ultimately decide his fate. "Ah, you saw it. I have no choice then. Yes, no choice at all." A woman's voice, he thought, low and cold, and somehow enjoying herself, he felt. "Gwa!" He didn't even have time to turn around. The instant he decided to turn toward the voice, he was blown away by a colossal impact. His back slammed against the wall, knocking the lagmite out of his hand, which left him in complete darkness. But that wasn't what Subaru was focused on. His entire consciousness was devoted to hot. He felt a terrible heat coursing through his entire body. This is really bad. He felt the hard floor against his cheek and realized that he had collapsed onto his face. His strength was completely gone, and he had already lost sensation in his fingers. The heat from his core was so excruciating it made him want to tear his throat out. Hot, 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 hot. The moment he opened his mouth to scream, what spilled forth was no shriek. It was a clump of blood. He vomited up large quantities of his lifeblood as he coughed. Frothy blood started foaming up at the corners of his mouth as he gurgled. Within his dim field of view, the ground had been dyed red. "Ah, this is all my blood?" There was enough to soak his fallen body. Blood comprises about 8% of the human body, and it is said that losing about a third of that would be life-threatening. But it seemed to him that he'd already lost just about all of it. He had stopped vomiting blood, but the heat that felt as though it would incinerate him still persisted. He moved his hand toward his abdomen with great difficulty, and having felt an impossible sensation there, he understood. "My stomach's been torn open, huh?" It was no wonder he felt so hot. It seemed his brain had confused pain for heat. He was almost torn in half. Only a bit of skin at his back held him together. In short, it seemed that this was checkmate for him. The moment he realized this, his consciousness started fading. Even the heat which was making him writhe in agony had disappeared. Even the unpleasant feeling of blood, and the sensation in the hand he'd used to feel his organs. It was all fading away along with his consciousness. All that was left was his body, which would not be able to accompany his soul. This body used the last of its disappearing consciousness to move just a little. It turned its head upward. Black shoes formed ripples in the pool of blood before his eyes. There was someone there, and that someone was most likely the one who killed him. Strangely, he didn't feel like looking at their face. This person was the one who took his life, and yet he still decided to simply remain a spectator to his own demise. He had no clue who they were, but right now he didn't really care about that. He only wished for the girl's safety. "Baru?" He felt like he heard a voice like the chime of a bell. He was beyond the point where he could even differentiate his senses, so he probably just imagined it. Despite that, even supposing it wasn't real, he found it extremely comforting. So, a short scream, and then the carpet of blood welcomed yet another person. She had fallen right next to him, exactly where his arm was. Her fair hand dropped powerlessly and intertwined with his. Probably just a coincidence. He felt her fingers move slightly, as if squeezing his hand. 8. He forced his disappearing consciousness to return for a moment. The pain and the heat, everything had faded away. It was a meaningless effort, nothing but a loser wasting time. But even so, I will, definitely, save you. At that moment, Natsuki Subaru lost his life.